Did you watch the movie Mad Max and think it was historical?
No.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast. I'm your host, Jeff, and with me, as always, are my co-hosts, Mona and Alan. We are post-evangelical ministers and theological thinkers grappling with our place in the progressive Christian world. Thank you for joining us for another conversation on faith and culture.
Culture.
Gotta thank you for throwing in the echo. That's exactly what we needed right there, was an echo. All right.
Little showmanship.
Little show. All right.
A little pizzazz for you.
I don't know. This week, we are going to be asking the question, does God feel emotions? And for our segment, we are going to be doing another round of Would You Rather. So this topic, Alan, you're bringing the topic to the table, which I appreciate.
Right.
Take some work off my table.
Course.
So go ahead and what do we mean when we ask the question, does God feel? Because I think we use rhetoric a lot of the time, like that breaks the heart of God or, whatever. I mean, so do we really believe that God actually feels emotions, is an emotional being? So let's real quick answer with one word, each of us, and then we'll just unpack it from there. I think that would be fun.
We haven't done this yet.
So, Alan,
and we mean in the usual sense of emotions.
Yes.
Yes.
So that's your answer? Yes.
My answer is yes. So yeah. Yes.
Okay.
My answer is yes.
Mona.
I don't like this yes or no business. What's happening here? Don't shove me to a binary.
Your binary.
You got to do it.
I don't.
Play the game.
It's a complicated question. No.
It's a complicated
I refuse to conform.
So your answer is no.
No, my answer is neither of those options.
I'm going to say no.
You're going to say no. Are you saying no just to be contrary?
No, I'm really saying no because I actually believe that.
You're actually saying no. Okay.
And it's funny because it sort of mirrors our personalities. Like, emotions are the most important thing in the world to me. So, of course, God has emotions. And Jeff's like, I'm a Vulcan and I will logically assess this situation and come up with the answer. No.
Talk about binaries, man. Let's just put us all in a box right there. What the heck?
Right. Yeah. That's what our theology does. So yeah, the question is like, are all of the references to God feeling or experiencing emotion simply anthropomorphisms, or like understanding God using human terminology, though God is not human? For instance, we say, in the Psalms talks about God's righteous right hand or, feet or body or whatever, but classic, I guess, Christian theology doesn't believe God has a body. God is not, doesn't have parts, is not a body. And so anytime a body is referenced throughout scripture or maybe people's worship songs or whatever, it's just an anthropomorphism to understand something about God. It's not literally referring to a body. So the question is that the same with emotions? Or does God actually feel emotions when that is spoken? And so how you determine that kind of has fallout for a lot of different things. I think it affects, we talked a little bit about how it affects prayer, right?
What do we mean by emotions, though? We have to ascertain our foundational assumptions about what emotions are before we ask if God has them or not.
We do. And we could, do the whole, there are 3 elements on the periodic table, wind, fire, and water kind of thing. Or like there's only 4 or 5 emotions, like in the movie Inside Out that we talked about in a previous episode. Right.
Yeah, but that can't be our source for this episode.
Of course not.
It's not a source.
Of course not.
This is why this is a really complicated question, because it hinges on other assumptions or beliefs about God. If you mean emotions in the sense of like a brain activity, hormones that and chemicals that flood your brain and make you experience certain sensations through your body, because emotions are very body based, and you don't believe God has a body or like chemicals that can flood God's brain because God's not material, then God can't have emotions like us. But like Alan, like you said, if there's not only biblical basis, but actually philosophical basis to believe that God does in fact have emotions.
Yeah. Or chooses to be that way in connection with human beings. And, somehow creates that. So for me, emotions is not, when I speak about God having emotions, I think you're right. It's not an embodied thing. We experience emotions in the sense that something happens in the external world or happens to us, and emotions kind of happen to us, right? Before we can even consciously engage the fact that we're angry because something has caused that. And so I think for some people, it bothers them that something could affect God before or a priori or whatever, to God having a will to control some sort of reaction. So I think that when I talk about emotions, I'm talking about because of who I am, when something affects me, feelings arise, right? And I think about God in the same way. Because of who God is, when something affects God or happens to God, there is a change that happens inside of God in relation, not in who God is, but in relation to the event or the other that God has created that is interacting with God. I guess that's a lot of language, but basically God can be affected on like an emotional level kind of thing.
It's more complicated than that, even what you're saying. I think those are good points, but it goes into the question of God's omniscience as well. Does God know everything? Because in our understanding of emotions, our embodied human understanding of emotions that has been informed by psychology, like in the last 100 years, the discovery of the subconscious, and that emotions are things that percolate up through our subconscious, and they often happen before we're aware of them. They're already working on us or working in us. And so if God has perfect foreknowledge, then God doesn't have a subconscious for emotions to percolate up through. So can God really react to something if God knew it was going to happen? This question opens up a giant can of worms.
Yeah, and speaking of open, it crosses over to open theism, which a lot of people who I think find this a really meaningful conversation are open theists, and I kind of flirt with that a little bit. And that's the idea that I'm open when it comes.
You've
to
hooked
that.
up a few times.
The idea that the future hasn't happened, and that because of quantum physics or whatever, there's not a determined set future, but there is actually real chance in the world, and God can make claims about the future and say, I'm going to do this in the future. I'm going to send a Messiah or whatever. And that's different than saying God knows every single thing that will happen in the future. And so people who hold to open theism really find this meaningful because God is actually reacting to history as it's happening. And I'm not quite sure where I am with all of that, but I tend to think about the emotional conversation from like a more historical sense. Like I find it really interesting that Stoicism, the Greek philosophy that started in the 3rd century BCE with Zeno, was the most popular form of Greek philosophy during the early church. Like Marcus Aurelius and other Caesars were Stoics. All of like the thinkers were Stoics, and the
Paul
Stoics
was influenced by Stoicism,
right?
As well,
Yeah, absolutely.
heavily.
And the Stoics believed that things like anger, envy, jealousy, even like sexual attachment or love for anything was like an error in logic. And so they really divided up human experience between the logical, the logos, which is, the word in Greek existed before the New Testament was written. But the New Testament talks about God as being the logos, like the thing that has fated the whole universe, the mind behind the universe that has no emotions, right? Because it's perfect, it won't make these errors that we make that give us all these emotions. And so the goal of human life was to be logical and to separate yourself from like emotional living.
Yeah, emotions were seen as frail, like antithetical to proper reasoning. And also, I want to just throw something in there. We've talked about this in the past. That they were assigned to femininity. And it was considered very shameful if a man failed in logic and acted too much like what they perceive to be a female sort of way of being in the world, or a feminine way of being in the world. That's why that honor-shame dynamic exists.
That philosophy doesn't exist anymore, so why do we even need to talk about that?
Not at all.
We're not seeing that firsthand in the presidential election at all, Anyway, go ahead.
Exactly. I mean, so that's why feminists have had such a horse in the game actually to demonstrate why God has emotions, because that includes women into divine ways of being. Whereas if you have a really masculine concept of God that is unemotional, it tends to also exclude women. No offense to present company. I'm sure that's not intention, but that's the historical reception. Or
Right.
That's what feminists like Mary Daly have argued, from early on.
Yeah. And it's offensive to me as a man to have my masculinity equated with stoicism, to be, very blunt. That's dehumanizing in my opinion. That's like forcing men to give up some sort of claim to emotional intelligence, which is the ability to like know what you're feeling, to express it, to understand what other people are feeling. And it's funny that was seen as like the lowest rung of rationality. That was like that was the irrational, was to engage in all those things.
I think that going back to what you were talking about earlier, Mona, is that our emotions are intimately connected with our physical body. We know that more and more. So to ascribe emotional reactions to God seems counterproductive on that one level. And then the other idea of it is if scripture or someone has a God experience and describes how they believe God feels, I think that if God feels, I think it's more along the lines of something that is beyond us, but similar to the way that we experience emotions, so that the best way that we can understand how God reacts in that situation is by describing it as emotions.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, that could be the only language we have to explain God's actions. I want to go back to the open theism thing, Alan, what you were saying earlier, for two reasons. First
Before
of all,
we bounce away from what Jeff said,
yeah.
I kind of want to talk about that.
Sure.
Everything that Jeff said could be said of rationality as well. Our rationality is completely tied to our body. Our thoughts and our processes, the whole system we have created of logic is only a result of us being embodied human beings. So therefore, God shouldn't have any sort of logic or rationality involved, or any mind that we can think of. So like, it's almost regressive. It's like, I understand that we seek to create a God in our own image, right? We have the desire to anthropomorphize God in such a way. The options are, if we're not going to do that, it's regressive all the way to some sort of non-personal life force that sustains all of the universe, right? Doesn't think, doesn't feel, doesn't really interact with us on any sort of personal level, and you end up with deism. So I think if you're which is a way to go, but it's like, if
it's not this, it's that. Like Jeff was saying, that you can, like, God can have rationality that's just so beyond our rationality that it's not, because our rationality, you're right, is like limited to our embodied contextuality and our perspective. It's not all knowing, right? So,
but we can talk about these things in differences of degrees, not categories. You get what I'm saying? Like, yes, God has maybe. I don't really ascribe as much anymore after talking to you two for like a year and a half to the concepts of perfection necessarily. I think some of those are problematic, but we could say God's emotions are like much more infinite than ours, right? You see more of the spectrum of light than we can see, feel more of the spectrum of the emotional spectrum than we feel, or think with much more rationality, much clearer than we do, or something like that. So I can talk about like degrees, but it doesn't mean that God doesn't have those things just because we do, And I think Jeff's right in saying that it's problematic for me to hear someone else say, I know what God feels about this situation, because in some ways that's inaccessible. We can say what we think God experiences, but that's not our experience, right? And we're looking through a mirror dimly, as the New Testament would say, and we have to be humble about that. But that's just saying that it's impossible to fully know is radically different than saying God is like a non-personal being that we interact with, because the God that, like, I don't know, I find in the New Testament and in the Bible, and as a part of my Christian makeup and faith, is a personal God. And that's like, right, the God of the Trinity. The Trinity's founded on that, in my opinion. Divine love is founded.
Please stay on one point. Don't talk about the Trinity now.
Right.
Good Lord.
But that's what I'm saying, Alan, is I think you're jumping to I think you're saying because we can't describe those things that it automatically makes it impersonal. I don't think that that's the case. I think that you can't connect those two. Right. I think that if anything, it makes it personal on a level that we can never fully comprehend. But that doesn't make it impersonal.
Hyper personal.
Exactly.
So it's the difference. It's the difference in definition that we have.
For me, it's like very shaky ground to argue even the varying degrees of like, if God doesn't feel emotions like we feel, then God is deistic, because concepts of justice completely fall apart. If you can't make serious claims that when someone is like abused, then it hurts God, or like God has a reaction, or even if it's within God's structure of holiness or something, like to strip completely away any notion, even if it's anthropomorphized, that God is grieved by that sin or that evil or that oppression, like where does justice go if you take that apart?
Right. I'm not saying
we're
you have
describing
to.
it. Okay, but we're describing it in the words that we have. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you're saying some people opt to go that direction.
I was saying you could. I was saying you could take everything that was said about emotions and apply it to like rationality, and like say, you know, and it's just like it's like a rabbit hole kind of thing is all I was referring to, is that you could do that. You could apply that's where I think this whole conversation falls apart, is the definition of emotions as being something other than like rationality or logic or whatever, or like opposed forces. Because for me, again, the way I define emotions is like not an error in logic, not something that's wrong, but being affected by other things causing changes in me, in my body, in my person, in my being, whatever. And I believe that God is affected by the world. And so when I say deistic, that's like God is unaffected by the world. Whatever happens in the world doesn't necessarily matter. It's not going to affect God. That's like the definition of deism, right? And a theistic God is one. And so maybe my definition of emotions is totally different than someone else's. I know that, for instance, the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is foundational for Presbyterians, says God has no passions. God, it has all these things, but God has no passions. God is not passible. God is not affected on an emotional level by the happenings in the world. So there's at least, and maybe they understand emotions totally different than I do, but at least for me, it's the ability to affect a change in another
No, but
person.
you're talking about two different types of change. Like there's a change that the open theologians would say, like, for God to experience an emotion, or for God to like experience emotion and then change God's mind, which there are several scriptural references to that. Like God was grieved and then God did something different, or God heeded the repentance of the people and then God acted differently.
Exodus 32 says that Moses talked with God and God changed God's mind about punishing the people.
So that's one kind of change and being affected. There's another kind of change that would lie in the realm, we talked about this off air a little bit, of process theology, which none of us, it's incredibly philosophical and incredibly dense, and none of us are well versed in it, but we know enough to kind of talk about it. So we might not do it much justice here, but process theology would believe that God actually over time evolves, because not only does God not know the future, but God is so affected that God evolves alongside the world, and God changes, like in a big sense, can change or learn, that God can actually, that God doesn't know everything, that God learns along with history. So you could argue, people argue that if God is not the great, some of the classical proofs for God is that God is the being to which no greater can be conceived. And if God can change, then you can imagine a greater being than a God that doesn't change. And if that God is greater, then that must be the God of gods, and we're serving a lesser God if we think God can evolve. So that would be like the counter argument. So the change you're talking about, Alan, is like being affected by the world and being responsive to the world. And it's interesting. I think for me that the question of foreknowledge is super important. And I want to jump back to that for a sec. Because if God knows the future, then God if God knows the future and feels emotions, like close to a sense that we do, of course not in the same way, because if God doesn't have a body like we do, or chemicals in God's brain, then God I don't know if God cries or not. We can't prove that. Nobody will ever be able to prove that. But let's just say God does experience emotions like we experience them, and that's part of our divinity, is being able to experience and empathize and grieve and laugh. Maybe that's the most God that we are like. Who knows? Let's say God does not knows the future and experiences emotions. That means that God is grieving like all of the wars that have ever been fought and all of the wars that will ever be fought all the freaking time. Like God is in a constant state of grief and a constant state of joy, and God experiences all emotions all at once at all times. And therefore, does God even experience the emotion? Because maybe it just collapses into a big black hole, because it's like so much that it's nothing, you know?
And that's where I'd punt to the infinity of like the infinitude of God, right? God is big enough to, and this is like pastoral language. God is big enough to handle the different emotions, big enough to handle what is going on, both sad and happy and joyous at the same time. And just the fact that God would take pleasure in creation, or that the universe would happen, the universe would exist, would evolve over billions of years, is an act of God. And like, you know, we create stuff and we take pleasure in it. God is taking pleasure in all of this happening at the same time. That's so much pleasure, it would break the meter, right? Like that's like what that's saying. But God is, and this is where I think about transcendence again. God is above and beyond all that we experience and imagine, and can handle all of that at once. But it is mind-boggling to think about the fact that God is even witnessing everything that happens with all of the death that happens in biology, right? Evolution depends upon the idea that more animals die than we see, right? There's more deceased species than exist right now, maybe even 100 times more, I don't know. And like billions and billions and billions of deaths all the time. So I could see why that would be difficult to reconcile. But that gets into like evil and God. I think dialing it down maybe in one emotion would probably help. Like pain. This is probably makes it a little more clear.
I don't think pain's an emotion.
Sadness,
a sensation.
grief.
Okay.
Grief. Yeah. So Jeremiah 31, for instance, talks about God's heartbreaking, God experiencing pain for Ephraim, looking at this group of people who have kind of gone their own way and hurt themselves and blah, blah, blah. Is that just an anthropomorphism, or does God actually suffer? Theologians for thousands of years of history would say, no, God does not suffer, because that makes God weak. And if God can be affected in that way, then there's something wrong with God, right? And I am saying
liberation
that's
theologians have come alongside and said that that has been the exact same reasoning that has excluded the poor from conversations about theology and from because if you believe that God is this sovereign, all-powerful being, then God shows favor, and whoever's got power, whoever's got favor, whoever's got wealth, obviously God chose them to have those things. And so God, in God's sovereign will, has chosen the wealthy to be wealthy or whatever. Like this is how this has gone. Like sovereignty has been incredibly oppressive in some cases. And so if you believe that God is the God of the oppressed, that God even makes God's self weak on purpose, or chooses to align with the weak, or chooses to evolve, or chooses to grieve, even if God doesn't have to, then God is coming alongside the lowest of the creation. So it's really powerful theology.
Yeah, and I have no other way to think about that. If God does not actually grieve the injustice in the world, then I have no way personally to reconcile my faith to that. You know what I mean? If I'm forced to believe in a God that doesn't grieve, and a God that's not affected by evil in that sense toward people that are oppressed, then like it all kind of breaks down for me.
I'm going to say something that's going to be very difficult. I'm going to go there. What good is it to have a grieving God if God can't or won't stop horrible evils from happening? If God is affected that deeply and it really does grieve God for evil to happen, then why doesn't God do something about it?
Because it would override the freedom that God gives to the universe. I think it's impossible for me now as a theologian to take a step back and look at cosmic evolution, biological evolution on our planet, on all those things, and not say at least God has given some measure of freedom to this universe for whatever reason, and this is the universe that we have. There's chance, right? Chance that is involved in all of that. And for God to constantly step in and stop whatever is happening is prevents that freedom from happening, Well,
I don't think that it's not even just why doesn't God step in constantly? Is like, you also have to answer the other side of that coin is what makes God step in when God does, or do you believe that God ever steps in? So then the question of miracles and all that stuff comes in, and then
divine action.
Then it becomes even more problematic. Like, because I think you're right. I think that we've set up this, or that God has set up this universe's freedom, and we talk a lot about injustice. I mean, one of the central key components of trying to bring about justice is allowing people to have their own agency. And whether you
Right.
step in for good or not for good, it doesn't matter. You're taking away someone else's choice and agency on a certain level. So if we solve this, this will be the most popular podcast episode ever in the history of the world. But I have a couple problems. Is number one, I think it's problematic to use Scripture as a reference to that. If Scripture says God grieved, because given all of our stances on Scripture, that is, it's trying to describe something else, and I don't think that we can.
It's not a surefire 1-to-1 correlation. The Bible says it, therefore I do it, therefore I believe it. We can look at it and say this is an anthropomorphism. It can be interpreted differently.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think that there's again. I think that there's that level of grief, and I think there is something to the idea of God not stepping in due to the fact that God has given us all a certain amount of agency or complete agency or whatever. But I don't know. That's why I think this whole conversation about is God affected? I think if you're using in terms of motion, in terms of affected by humanity or creation, I would say yes, because I believe that God is intimately connected with those things. And that's the very nature of connection, right? Is that this happens and this is affected and all that kind of stuff. But where the cause and effect comes into that, I don't know. And I guess the real question is, what does it matter? Like the belief that you hold, what does it matter in the way that you live your life, in the way that you encounter people? Like when you are faced with real life justice, does that philosophy affect the way you approach people and the agency of others and yourself?
I think chance is hugely important in this conversation. I want to go back to what you said, Alan, about quantum physics. Not that I have much to say about quantum physics because I'm not a quantum physicist, but quantum physics actually really impacted theology a lot because all of a sudden this idea of chance being built into the fabric of the universe, like randomness is built into the fabric of the universe. Like Creator God planted randomness into the fabric. That means that you have to debunk old notions of, we talked about debunking old notions of sovereignty, like God chooses this and that person to have, and God, because God really loves those people and everyone else just, you're kind of screwed, or that God like uses, certain people like to turn them against so that God uses them for God's purposes, like Pharaoh, like turns Pharaoh's heart against God so that God's purposes can be meted out. Actually, did you know that there is a faction of conservative evangelicals who are kind of spreading this notion that Donald Trump is God's agent in the world?
That, like the Old Testament king or whatever. Yeah, I've heard that.
He's a necessary evil. Like they agree he's evil. But he's a necessary evil. So like if they
just like Cyrus or whatever from the Assyrian thing that let the people go back and rebuild the temple.
So they genuinely believe if they elect this guy into office, that God will bring America back to Jesus. Like they really genuinely believe that. I find that really fascinating, and I don't understand how you could believe that in a democracy. And like you don't put that guy in power on purpose. Like he might rise to power as a tyrant, but like that's not in a democratic
I also
state.
think it's instructive in the middle of you talking about the Bible in that way. The stuff that we have from the Bible is written after the fact. We don't have prophecies of someone saying Cyrus is the one, and that what we have is texts written after the fact that are explaining in their way of understanding history that this is what God was doing for us all along, right? It's different than saying Donald Trump is God's mouthpiece and needs to be listened to, so it's
the same thing.
Exactly. So you'll find very few people, you'll find very few theologians, if any, really saying that God acts like that sovereignly, like moving us around like pawns in a chess game. That softened over the course of time to say, well, maybe God rolls cosmic dice. God's just got these big old dice up there, and God rolls them for like each individual life or each individual situation, and like whatever, the chance comes out, that's kind of like your lot, So, but with the advent of quantum physics interacting with theology, and the belief that chances and randomness is built into the fabric of the universe, you can't deduce anything from being born in one country and being born in the next, having some chemicals in your brain and other people having none. Like the fact that I wasn't born a sociopath is a random act of chance. And actually you can see this in so I'm going to talk about the Bible. Shock and awe. that story of Jesus and the blind man. And remember, the blind man was brought before the Sanhedrin or the court, and people were like, well, his parents were sinful, that's why he was born blind. And Jesus is like, that's not true. He debunked it. He's just like, it was just a product of the random chance that's built into the fabric of the universe.
No, Jesus said specifically he was given this on purpose so that for this very moment. So he was made blind so that I could show you something.
No, you're right. Actually, okay, so that would be a sovereignty. Oh, shoot. I totally just debunked my own
I think it's interesting
argument.
you mentioned randomness. Like, I feel like the more I learn and the more like information I soak in, the less I believe in randomness. Like, I don't know
natural
I don't know if I
believe
believe that randomness is inbred into the fabric of the universe. I think we just haven't been able to explain it yet. I don't know. I believe less and less.
It is, though. I really think there is a threshold. It's possible that we will solve the quantum theory problems, but like as it stands right now, it probably won't be solved. And there really is randomness at the base of reality. How that leads to predictability, like in physics and biology, is a really fascinating question. There are philosophers who argue between determinism and like on a natural way, not that God has determined the world, but that physics itself, once the universe began and spun, it's determined completely for all of the future. There are some people that believe that, some people that don't, and it's a really complicated argument to kind of go either way. But even given that, like even given foreknowledge that God knows everything that's going to happen, God could still be affected,
I don't think like, God does know what's going to happen. Actually, I don't believe in foreknowledge.
Yeah, that's at least open theism, if not process theology, right? Open theism is that God doesn't know the future, right?
It's just infinite mathematical possibilities. Like it goes to infinity, which
But it's not an either or thing. God can still be sovereign in the sense that God is in control, can choose to take an action at one time or another, or stop acting. I think God, so that's my thing. I think God's always acting. I think like it's an illusion to think that God is other than the universe in such a way that God steps in when something, I think always at all times, the physical processes themselves are miracles. That anything exists at all at any moment is a miracle that is held together by God in a miraculous way. That's so how God I look at it.
The God is the fundamental life force. We're all agreeing on that.
The fundamental existence, right? And so if God's gonna like stop doing something or start doing something or make a decision, like it's almost like the water we swim in. It's difficult to explain because but I do believe God affects history. However we arrive at this, God has chosen, in my mind, in my theology, to interact with human history. And that requires an element of emotions in my mind. That requires an element of responding to humans and humans responding to God, at least for me to understand it the way that I do.
I don't know.
I don't know how you get away from that.
I agree with all that stuff you were saying, but I think we counteract that whole concept and feeling of how God is connected to the universe and to history when we use the word sovereign. I hate that word because I think it implies this. The word sovereign, it comes from this hierarchical, right. God is pulling the strings and all that kind of stuff, and it doesn't speak to the idea of interconnectivity. Not full on. I always forget the word, the theism. Is it pantheism? Which is the one where God is in
pantheism? Is God is everything is God. Pantheism, which I love, is that everything exists inside of God.
There we go. Way. So more along those lines. If everything exists in God, then it can't not be affected.
God, we've arrived at the age-old philosophical 101 question: can God make a rock so big that God can't move it? It's what I'm trying to say is it's the same question: is God so affected that God cannot stop being affected? But if God is all powerful, then God should be able to stop. God should be able to do whatever God wants to do. So maybe the question is God's will to be affected or not? And I think there's a lot of people from multiple religious traditions would say that God does will to be affected by us, whether God has to or not.
Which is a really powerful kind of thinking. I like to approach it from Jeff was like, well, what does it matter, right? How does that have any impact on our day-to-day living? And I think it's a powerful thing to think of God not in terms of pulling the strings behind history, but having a dynamic relationship, listening, thinking, feeling. And when we interact with God, stuff is actually happening, you know, that it's not an impersonal force, but something that we have a give and take with. I think that's a very powerful thing. And I think you were right to talk about social justice because it gives rise to social justice. That puts a lot of power in people's hands, in creation's hands, to do big stuff, right? I mean,
yeah, I think about it a little bit differently. I think about God more as a force, I think, and less personal. And I think God is not only the force that sustains the universe, but I think God is our ability to love. I think that is God's being with us. And the fact that we are at any given moment able to love means that God's presence is with us and in us, and
it's an expression of
working on us. But it is God. I mean, I think that's one of the most profound statements that's ever been uttered, that God is love. Not like love, not gives love, not loves love, but God actually is one-to-one equation love. And so when I think about it that way, I think, my understanding is that love has its own agenda. And so I think to just argue that God is emotional for the sake of being emotional is hard for me to understand or argue. But when I think about God being love, and that love itself has a vector, a trajectory, an agenda, an end goal of health and life and vitality and goodness, then that to me is a lot easier to argue, I guess, than a God that's just kind of sad with us but can't do much, or a God that acts in opposition to what we might perceive would be just emotion, Because a lot of people, I know people personally who believe that, when bad things happen, God might be a little sad, but it's ultimately for the greater good, and God really wants it to happen, so you should submit yourself to it. I don't know.
And I don't believe that, but I'm not with you on the God is kind of an impersonal force. And I think this is where we differ on this podcast, is that I'm still, I guess, conservative in a lot of ways, or orthodox historically, because I still believe in Trinitarian theology, that God is three separate persons in one being, and that God is a personal being in the sense that relationship is built into who God is. And that means affirming the other even within God, and affirming the other as us. And that seeing the other and being seen by God as other is an important element to emotions. And I think that it's not just panentheistic, it's all one. I guess there is a sense that that's true, but the otherness of God and the otherness of us is very important in my conception of my faith. And so if God is these three people forever connected in relationship, spinning in love or whatever, related to each other in love, bringing human beings into that is is a very powerful thing. And I think it affects my daily living in the way that I speak to God, in the way I look at other people, right? The way I pray for other people. I think it really does come down to prayer. Jeff, you were asking, does it make any difference? I think it does. If God experiences emotions and experiences differences based upon what I do, my interactions with God will be different. If God's unchanging and none of this even really matters, I'm not going to speak to God in the same way. You know what I mean?
I don't know. I don't think there's any really difference between what you two are saying. I'm having a hard time grasping this idea, the difference between seeing God as a force and seeing God as personal,
as a person,
as two separate things. I feel like as soon as we have words for something, it loses a little bit of its luster, a little bit of its magic, a little bit of its mystery and feeling, for lack of a better word. Because we use the word force, and I think we have this idea of this disembodied, something we'll never be able to explain. But then we use personal, and I think it becomes too narrow.
Jesus is my boyfriend.
Yeah, or my homeboy, or whatever shirt is out there to...
I'm not saying you're saying that, Alan, but that's the only really concept that I can understand. And again, the word person, we're using that because that's a concept that we're familiar with, but that might be very far from what actually the Trinity is, if the Trinity exists, right?
I do there's some Greek theologians, John Zizioulas, I don't know how to say his last name, that talks about being and personhood as the essential being. Person for God and for humans, Like personhood is a reference to the other in connection. You're a person when you are an other that is connected to other others. You're not a person by yourself. Personhood is defined as being your own thing while in connection to these other people. And then so like that's what I mean by personhood, is that God is other than me, different, but at the same time connected to God's own self and to me.
And
maybe the better question is like,
no, hold on. What I believe in as force is not like a Star Wars sense of like magic that you can kind of tap into and then control. I'm really informed by Tillich in this way. Tillich talked about God as the ground of all being. So God is not being, God is the ground to which being comes out of or emerges. So just think that one's just a mind F, just like just let yourself think about that for a while. God is the ground of all being. And also Tillich talks about God as the power to be. So everything that has being and everything that has existence, God is the power that not undergirds it. The under language is problematic. The power that allows it and gives it ability, gives it life and animation, that God is the great animator. So when I say force, like I'm to me, when you think about God as really the ground of being, the idea of talking to the ground of being, like, and using actual language breaks down for me. It doesn't make sense anymore. So,
and it does for me because I believe God has, yes, I agree with you about the ground of being, but I believe God has entered into relationship in a special way with us as human beings.
So God kind of puts on human-ish skin and walks around and relates to us?
It affects God. Exactly. Just like Jesus.
I thought you would appreciate that. The ground of being
come in the flesh. That's right.
Well, I mean, that's the great mystery of Christianity, I suppose.
It is.
We've arrived at the logos.
Oh, it's a scandal. Okay, this is what I wanted to talk about. You just helped me. Thank you so much for not letting me forget about this.
You're welcome.
Historically, Christians have always known that Jesus is scandalous in the sense that there's something called the scandal of particularity, that it was a particular person at a particular time, a particular day, a particular nation, a particular woman that gave birth to God or whatever is scandalous, that God wasn't all, right? But God was one thing in a certain place. And I think that's what this conversation has a problem for some people, is that God would relate to human beings. That's a particularity kind of thing. God is not a generalized thing in that moment. In the moment that God experiences emotion and connection to your experience, God becomes particular and not general. And I think that like breaks my brain when I think about God, that God would have edges, or like God would have
form.
So you think of a tree, right? A tree doesn't exist. Trees exist. There is no tree platonic form out there to which trees kind of subscribe. Everything we've ever seen or ever known or ever has been is a particular tree with certain ridges, right? And so when we think of God, we think of generalities. But when God interacts with nature, God's not interacting with humans, but individual human beings who have their own experiences. So it kind of like particularizes God. And I think that's a powerful thing to start thinking about, that God has, edges to it, edges, because God has chosen to enter into relationship with the other. God has necessarily limited God's self is a pretty powerful thing. Jeff is kind of right that getting so far out into the theoretical is one way to go, but like asking, is it helpful to use emotion language to talk about God, is also an interesting question.
Well, no,
is that helpful?
What I was going to tack on to what you were saying, though, is that like that's one aspect of the scandal of Christianity. The other aspect is that if God truly did reveal God's self in the person of Christ, God did not come as a king. God came on a freaking donkey and slept outside and cried when his friends died. Like, that's showing so much weakness that in the ancient world, that was completely offensive to so many traditions. So that's the other scandal of Christianity, to presume that God could and would choose to become that weak. And to the point of letting God's self be executed. Philosophers have written tomes about how strange and weird and marvelous that idea is, that God would die.
But there's Christian theologians, and what I was taught from a quote unquote orthodox historical theistic stance was that God is not affected by even the crucifixion, that somehow there's a disconnect between God the Father and God the Son. And it's a heresy to think about passionism, that God is somehow crucified on the cross, right? That God the Father is
it's
affected.
not that God, that patripassianism is not that God was not affected at all. Yeah.
That's what it is.
That God can suffer, but that's
Right.
not to say that God can have emotions.
But it's like God the Father suffers.
Right,
It's okay to say
like,
Jesus suffers because, like, it's okay to say the second person of the Trinity.
Sense. But they don't mean suffer in an emotional sense. They mean suffer in like a physical, like feel physical pain. Because God, if God doesn't have a body, like the ultimate Father, God doesn't have a body, and God shouldn't be affected. But if God didn't have emotions during the crucifixion, then like why was the temple like veil torn asunder, according to the witness? Like early Christian writers believed that God had an incredibly emotional response. There was earthquakes and crap that happened. Like God like shook the cosmos.
Maybe that's at least instructive. The people we've been reading in Exodus, Genesis, Jeremiah, in the New Testament, Jesus' parables, God has emotions toward humanity. Is it still helpful to use that? Is it still helpful to talk about God in an emotional way? I think so. I think it's really problematic because it's hurt a lot of people, saying God's angry at you or God's this or that. I think it's terrible when it's like used incorrectly or in a dogmatic sort of way, like we could completely understand how God feels about a certain situation. But I think it's also really healing to think that God cares enough and is moved by our lives and what we experience. Just as a pastor, I think that's an important part of what I do. So,
yeah, I think I grew up with a lot of holiness talk, and for me, it's been helpful to go more toward the emotional language that God, comes alongside me and, grieves with me or rejoices with me, because I think people are trying to get at that idea in holiness. Like, God's holiness can't exist with sin, so God is grieved by your sin. And it turns into a very shaming thing. Like,
right.
If God is holy, then God has to exclude all evil, or because it's antithetical to God's nature to include it. I don't know.
Right.
Isn't that's interesting?
We should talk about that at some point.
All right. I
gotta talk about holiness.
Our time is
Jeff
running
is
out.
sick
And
of us.
before I plunge headfirst into atheism, let's give our final thoughts on whether God is affected or feels, or however we want to word that.
I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful to think about God in particulars, that God has relationships with particular people, and is not this generalized thing that we kind of keep in the back of our mind, or is not just a grounded being, but something that enters into a dynamic relationship and is changed by, and maybe Tillich would have said this, but to think that God is affected by what we do, for me, is a crucial part of, at least if you take the Bible as a whole and you want to like listen to the witness of the Bible and have that be a part of your theology, I think it's almost inescapable to think about God being affected emotionally by human beings for whatever reason.
I think love requires that our full bodied person experience, the entire sum of our existence in this earth, to really actually love and to be encompassed by love and to be drawn forward by love and to respond to those around us by love and to love ourselves. It requires that we be in touch with our full range of self and experience, which includes all of our emotions. And I think that God is within and without that process and urges us into better being in touch. And I think it's done horrific damage to say that emotions are only appropriate sometimes, that only some people should feel or can feel emotions, or that there are certain ways to experience emotions, or that some emotions are more shameful than others. Like, we've done so much damage. Let's just stop the madness and say, emotions are God-given. They're universal or nearly universal. And I tend to believe that because of that fact, we come from an emotional God. And maybe God doesn't experience emotions in the way that we experience them, but God certainly is with us in our experience of emotions, and therefore must understand them extremely deeply as pure love, God's self. The ground of our being is also the ground of our emotions. So maybe God is the energy out of which our emotions come from, and our emotions are given to us to inform us, to teach us how to live in the world better. I really do think that they're a gift. They are a gift. Your emotions are a gift. Do not run away from them.
I agree, and I agree with Alan. What you were saying earlier is that I think it is helpful to speak in emotional terms or in terms of emotion and thought when it comes to God. I just think that it is important, especially for leaders and teachers who are presenting these things to people, to hold it loosely and recognize that when they say God feels or God thinks, that it is a shadow of the reality of what's actually happening in God's person or self. And I think that, I guess I think that's true with everything that we talk about, is that whenever we speculate about who God is or talk about who God is or talk about our experiences about who God is and what we believe God to be, it's a shadow of the reality that's actually happening. And I think that's I should just get a bumper sticker that says "Hold it loosely," although that might be misappropriated. All right. Well, let us know what you think. If you have anything to add to this conversation or would like to dig a little deeper on the topic that we talked about, you can go at irenacast.com/80. This is 80, episode 80. That's amazing. For questions, comments, concerns, and suggestions for the show in general, you can always find all the ways to contact us at irenacast.com/feedback. On the other side of the music, we're going to be playing a round of Would You Rather. So I think if you've ever attended any kind of youth group gathering, you've probably played this game, and we have already on the show a couple times before, but it is Would You Rather? And we pose the question, would you rather do this or that? And then the other hosts have to pick which one they'd rather do. And in youth group, they're usually centered around something pretty disgusting. But I'd like to think that we're a little high.
We're past the immature potty humor, right?
I'm not
That's
mature.
still not a
I'll
thing.
take full responsibility for it.
That's why we invented the segment, is so that we can be immature after.
Well, listen, it's
whatever.
So we can rejoice in our humanity and remember that life is about more than issues and problems. That we come back. This is our centering, meditative, spiritual practice. Being silly,
kicking back and drinking a beer and shooting the breeze.
I got my whiskey. We're ready to go.
I'm drinking coffee and it's like 8:00 at night. There's a problem with me. Jeff, do you have one? Because I would like to play this game.
I do have one. Are you ready for it?
Yes.
I'm ready.
Can you handle it?
I was born ready.
Okay. This may seem like an easy question, especially considering that we are putting ourselves out there for hundreds to listen to every week. But I want you to be honest. Really think about it. Like, what's your gut reaction? Would you rather live in a world where there is complete world peace, or live in a world that you rule?
Oh, that's so easy for me. It's super easy. I would totally go with complete world peace, because then I also win in a way.
Wait, what? If you rule, you also win?
No. Because then I rule, in my own private domain, because we've achieved world peace. Everyone's happy. I'm happy, and I win. I rule. Like I
just thought of the Seinfeld episode that said "Master of my domain" or whatever. Master of the house, keeper of the inn. That's interesting. So you think world peace means everybody rules together at the same time, simultaneously over their little.
That's like the definition of
planet.
world peace.
No, I disagree.
There's other people that would disagree because they think hierarchy is very necessary.
Pax
Mona.
Romana.
I think it's basically like it's the world's, going back to a Seinfeld reference, it's the world all at once saying serenity now and just pushing it down.
I would say world peace only because I really don't like managing other people. It's just not my thing. I really looked up to Jeff because in his youth ministry, he could command legion at the snap of his fingers and really like support leaders and build them up and whatever. I hate telling people what to do. It really bothers me. I'll listen to you. I'll support you. I'll be there for you forever, whatever. But don't make me make you do stuff. That makes me uncomfortable. So I'm going to go with world peace just because it's easier for me.
I feel like this is a Miss America beauty pageant. Jeff, we all know you'd like to be in charge. Just admit it.
I'd rule the world. Like I'm not gonna lie.
You do.
I don't need
job.
there to be world peace because I will make sure that there's world peace.
Will force it.
Your peace for the whole world.
That's right. It's gonna be awesome. It's gonna be huge.
I would choose world peace because it would outlast me. You know, like even if you were like a super great leader, you know, when you die, when you kick the bucket, it's just all gone to crap, you know?
I don't know.
What do I care? I'm dead.
That's terrible. You don't actually feel that way. You don't actually believe
Jeff, stop it.
Stop it, you old silly so-and-so.
I thought this was a safe place where we could just be ourselves. And then
He let his guard down, and he's getting
your true self is a tyrant.
crucified.
It's true.
A benevolent tyrant, though, that needs to be said.
Oh.
A benevolent one.
Screw that. Doesn't
okay,
exist.
so would you rather, I'm going to just jump in there. Ready? Would you rather be angry for every moment for the rest of your life or be sad for every moment for the rest of your life? If you had to be one.
That sucks.
Angry.
You picked the worst ones.
Angry. Because honestly, like,
oh my God.
There's a little bit of a rush attached to being angry.
Dude, I've seen you drive, and I've seen people do some pretty bad things on the road. And I get a rush watching you get angry at other people on the road. And
see, that's where I'm going. I'm going angry.
There you
that
go.
Seems like a pretty easy one.
I'd go angry too, because I think just being settled.
Are you serious?
Like, to be epically sad for my entire life, I wouldn't be able to handle it. I wouldn't be able to do it.
I would do it.
I would
choose sadness. Absolutely. I would rather grieve.
Sad.
I would rather grieve every single freaking thing in the whole world than have to be angry for one freaking minute.
But anger is a form of grief.
Yeah.
Anger, no. Well, it's a stage of grief.
When are they different?
It's a stage of grief. They're very different. Anger is like you're railing against the world. Sadness is like in some ways you've accepted it, you know? And I would rather accept and observe rather than feel like I constantly have to like fight for the rest of my life. You know what I mean?
When you describe it that way, then I definitely want to remain angry. I don't accept anything that anyone puts in front of me.
That's awesome. There's at the turn of the century, the 1900s, there's these really like these musicians and like really masculine people. I forgot what the movement's called, but it's all about like speed and like crazy music that's like lots of metal and all kinds of stuff and progress and whatever.
The heck are you talking about?
And it just reminds me of, I don't even know what I'm talking about now.
There was just these people one time and they were mad. They were
super mad and they were fascist, I'm pretty sure.
They had some metal and they just thrashed around. It's
a movement.
All the time.
I just can't remember what it's called. And it had
metal music, guitar, angry. It was horrible.
Okay, hold on.
Did you watch the movie Mad Max and think it was historical?
No.
All right, Mona, give us your would you rather.
Yes.
Yeah, you guys ready for this?
Yes.
Okay. Would you rather touch everything you see or taste everything you hear? We're talking about full-blown synesthesia. Synesthesia is the mixing, it's like a cross-wiring of your senses, and people actually have this. I saw an interview with a guy who could taste everything that he said. He could taste it, like it tasted like flavors. But he was like, I had to break up this girl because every time I said her name, I tasted like really old, like mashed potatoes that had gone super bad. He's like, the interviewer was like, what's her name? And he goes, do I have to say it? And she's like, yeah. And he goes, Valerie. And he started making this face like, oh God, I can't, like I'm gonna puke. It was so funny.
It had to be Valerie.
Poor dude. Yeah, that's terrible. So anyway,
Valerie's a really good ex-girlfriend name. So I think I'm down with that guy.
Why don't you come on over, Valerie? Okay, listen. Would you rather touch everything you see or taste everything you hear?
So you're not actually touching the stuff. You just have the sensation of touching it when you see it.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Because that's the difference between like jail and torment.
Yes.
If you're just going around touching everything.
We're just going torment here.
Or everyone.
It's a form of prison, Jeff, not actual prison. All right?
No, but for like just going around touching people, you're going to end up in prison. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah.
If you do it in the right way, you can, technically.
No, there's no doing that in the right way.
There
especially
is.
if you look at the wrong place.
No, there's absolutely no doing that
I'm
the
really
right
sorry
way.
I'm doing this.
Okay.
Just so we're clear, Alan, you believe that this is a right way to inappropriately touch someone.
Everybody needs love, okay?
Oh my God. You have
probably
to edit
veering
that
into
out.
a different.
Oh, that's good.
boy.
I would say touch everything I see, even though that's like sounds freaking horrible. Like if you see something sharp, all of a sudden like you're feeling like you're being poked or whatever. I don't like that. But the thought of tasting what I hear is just like revolting. There's no way I could do it.
I'm gonna have to agree with Alan. Like sound affects me. You know, like the sensation when someone scratches on a chalkboard or something. Like there's certain sounds that really get me, and I because I know that feeling, I don't want to feel it again, and because the unknown of just being able to have the sensation of touch from everything I look at, like at least I have some control in that on what I look like. But sound I have no control over. People can just throw sound my way, and I guess it comes down to me again from what I can control and not control.
I've had phantom tastes. Have you guys had that before? Where you're just sitting there and then you experience something and all of a sudden you're like, dang, I taste sweet potato in my mouth right now. Like
what?
Crazy. It's like
no
Thanksgiving
way.
in my mouth. I'm not joking. That happens to me. Yeah, it's true. It happens to me randomly. It happened to me maybe like a month ago. I forgot what it was, but it was like, I taste pizza right now. And I hadn't eaten pizza in like maybe a month or two.
All right. Well, that is weird. Would you rather? And I guess the real question for those of you listening is, would you rather turn this off right now? Anyway,
Jeff is an angry despot who wants to touch everything he sees is all I'm getting out of this game. Those are the three things, right?
Yes, sure.
Basically.
I don't know. All right, well, I think that will be it for us this week. So if you enjoy what you hear and you want to support Irenicast, you can go to irenicast.com/support and find all the ways to show us some love. Appropriate love.
Not Alan's kind.
So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Thanks for joining the conversation.